I'm probably going to assume that you have some experience with Photoshop, but maybe not with animation or with pixel art. When I'm doing a pixel art animation, pixel art's quite a difficult thing to sketch because it's pixel perfect, so you can't really doodle in it, you have to be producing the final thing as you do it. So I tend to work initially at a larger scale and just use the paintbrush to sketch out my animations. I set up a timeline there, but we don't need to bother with that at the moment because the way that I do animations, it works on layers. So each layer is a separate frame of the animation. So what I do is I set a canvas to maybe 500 by 500 pixels or something like that, and use the paintbrush tool with a fairly bright color that's going to be quite separate, easily distinctive from the pixels that I'm going to be putting on later on. So the pixel art animation is going to be using kind of muted purples and blues. So I'm using this very bright magenta. So when I'm tracing over these sketches later on, I can keep the initial sketch and the final pixel art separate in my mind. So all I do is I draw my first position, then I create a new layer and set the first position to about 50% opacity or a bit less than that. And then I draw in the next position. This kind of lets me see how far I should be moving the arm or leg or whatever. And then I just work my way through from start to finish. Some people will do the start position, then the end position, maybe the middle position, and then fill in frames in between. I'm kind of doing that here in that I'm not drawing every frame that will be in the final animation. I draw in the first frame and then probably third or fourth, sixth or seventh. This is just kind of the key points of the animation. So you see here that her head moves quite a lot. There'll probably be another frame in between this and the final piece. So I just continue to sketch it out really roughly until I've got my full number of frames. I'm going with about 10 frames initially. At that point, you're going to want to open the timeline window. To open the timeline, what you want to do is go to Window at the top of the screen and scroll down until you see Timeline. Select that and your timeline will open up, and it'll probably look a little different from mine does at the moment on screen. This is because it's kind of to do with tweening and things like you would do in Flash. The way I work is I click Create Video Timeline, and then that changes me to the kind of more film looking thing where you have individual frames with different information on them. And then all you want to do is set each layer that you've done to be the only visible frame on each of those frames. So frame 1 has layer 1 at 100% opacity, frame 2 has layer 2 at 100% opacity, and so on. When it comes to doing pixel art, because of the way it works, there's a few important things you have to do with resizing images, but we'll come back to that later. All you have to do for now is make sure that you've set your image resizing to best for reduction, which if you go into Photoshop settings, general, you should see a third option down in a little drop box. So now what I'm doing is on top of the sketches, I'm redrawing my animation in pixel art, creating a new layer on top of the previous layer. So you can see there I have a pink sketch layer and then a new layer which has got my pixel art on it. The girl on the left there is just for color reference and rough sizing. I know that her arm is around 12 pixels long when straight, things like that. You don't want your proportions to wildly change as you go. So pixel art is actually quite a good thing for doing animation, and because you can count how long an arm is, you don't have to judge it. Saying that, I wouldn't always keep it 12. You're going to want to shorten it to suggest distance. So I'm just sketching over roughly my initial pink sketch, and I jump between the layers as I do it. And I've skipped ahead quite a bit here, and I've traced all of my layers. And what I do at that point is I make it full screen with a white background so that nothing's distracting me, and I watch it maybe 5 or 6 times, and I can see, well, that bit there needs to be faster, that bit, the speed looks okay. And then that tells me where I'm going to have to add in more frames. So between frames 2 and 3, she seemed to move a bit quick. So I'm adding in another frame there. And it just works the same way as before. You just add in a new layer between those two and make that 100% opacity. And then that's your layer. At this point, because I know the previous frame and the next frame, I might have both of them on a low opacity. So I might have frame 1 at 30% and frame 3 at 30%, so that I can see not only where the arm is coming from, but where it is going to. And then I'll draw in a new arm on frame 2, roughly halfway between those 2 points. So this is me. I've added in some more frames. I watch it again and again, see if there's anything that looks wrong. Maybe the speed doesn't look right, or here the leg seems to move in a kind of weird way. So I'm going to go back and fix that. For pixel art, I should have probably said this earlier, but unlike the paintbrush, you use the pencil tool, and that gives you a perfect pixel. If you use single pixel size, that gives you a single pixel on screen with no blurring or anything around the edges like a paintbrush will. Kind of like doing a sketch as well. The first run at the pixel art will basically get the rough shape. So for instance, I know that later on I want our bag to swing a bit, but when I'm doing the first run at this, all I'm really interested in is the movement of the body and whether the legs and arms seem smooth. So the bag will pretty much stay in the same place on our back the entire time. Once I know that the body is moving properly, I'll go back in and make the bag react to gravity a little bit more. So her body might turn, but the bag will stay in the same place for a frame. Likewise, once her body stops moving, the bag is going to continue on. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm making it seem like the bag is actually reacting to the space. The pockets would flap around as she turns. I never bothered doing any of that in the initial movement because it's sort of like adding detail later on. So I would just draw her without pockets, and then as I know the main movements are working, I'll go back and add that. Next, I'll probably think about doing some dust. Just kind of puts her in the space a little more. It won't work in all circumstances, but it's good to make the character interact with the environment a little bit. kind of messed around with that a little bit. I added in probably too much dust and then have to go back and remove it. There's a lot of watching your animation over and over again and seeing where you could improve it or what you could remove from it. I would say that pixel art is all about getting across the most amount of information with the least amount of pixels. What I'm doing now is I have a animation that I'm happy with. The movement is fine. All my pockets flapping and hair blowing around is fine. I'm just going to go in and add some highlights and shadows just to kind of make things a little clearer. For instance, her sleeve on her jacket is the same colour as the rest of her jacket, and because you can't have an outline, as she turns, her arm more or less disappears. I don't think this is a terrible thing. It helps in some ways, but I like to just put a sort of shadow outline around things of the same colour that cross over each other. That's not the only reason we'd use that shadow. You'd use shadow in the same way as if you were doing any kind of illustration to give some depth to the image. A lot of time for shadow, I would just select the same colour and darken it a bit, or I might even just select black and set it to maybe 20% opacity. That lets me do shadows for multiple colours at the same time. Once I'm happy with all my shading, I would save that, because the next thing we're going to do is change the size of this, and it's always good to have the original pixel art size version. So save it, then save it again and call it large. Now you have to go into preferences, general, and change your image interpolation to nearest neighbour. This means that when you change the pixel scale, the pixels will hold their sharp edges. You also want to change it by percentage rather than choosing a random pixel scale, because you need your pixels to increase equally. When you're initially drawing it in your 1:1 pixel scale, if you go to image size and change your pixel scale to something that isn't an even number, individual pixels at a larger scale could appear skewed. They could be 3:4 pixels wide, and then they're not square. Give everything a once over again and make sure that you're happy with the flow of everything. I watch it repeatedly on a loop for a long time. So what you want to do is go to Save for Web, and this window here will pop up, and then select GIF. Make sure your colours are set to 256, and if you've got a transparent background, make sure you've got transparency ticked. If you're not that bothered, then you might save a little space if you just make it a white background. Make sure your looping options are set to forever if you want it to continuously loop, and then just hit save.